Hey guys, Bill from BlenderBrit here. Today we're going to be taking a look at compositing. Specifically, we're going to look at how to combine render layers together to add in some fake mist and rolling fog effects. We're going to use Crptomatte to cheat with grass color variation and also to make color adjustments to specific parts of our render. And then we're going to go over some sort of general compositing stuff, color grading and vignettes and all the stuff you've seen a million times before, to get our nice and final result here. So yeah, let's jump over to Blender. First, before we can jump over to the Compositor, I have rendered out the scene already, but there are a few things that need to be done prior to compositing and rendering. So I'm just going to point those out. Now I've made use of the mist pass, at least on the background layer. So make sure that's enabled for whatever layer it is you need it enabled for. I've also, as I've just shown, separated up the scene into these view layers. Now, this has changed a little bit since 2.79. It took me a while to kind of get used to. I won't go into a huge amount of detail, but just to give you a rough idea, you can create as many of these layers as you want, and then whatever you want to see on this layer needs to be enabled via this checkbox. So if I turn off, I don't know, turn off the ground, for example, on the foreground now, if I were to render this, that foreground wouldn't appear. If I turn it back on, it does appear. But if I jump over to background, you'll notice the foreground's now unchecked. So these tick boxes only affect the render layer that you currently have selected, and you can select different ones for each render layer. And then when you render these out, they'll be available as separate images to work on. I hope that makes sense. So yeah, I have a foreground with my foreground stuff on and a background with my background stuff on. There's a lot of particle systems and other objects that I have muted at the moment. There's not any real need to bring them up. So yeah, I think that is all I need to cover. Oh, nope, nearly forgot. For the foreground, I'm doing quite a bit of work, or will be doing quite a bit of work using Cryptomatte. So I'm enabled object and material Cryptomatte passes, as well as the mist on the foreground anyway. So yeah, good. Let's jump over to the Compositor and get started. So this is what you'll see when you first finish your render and jump over to the Compositor. You have a composite node and a render layer node, and that's it. And we'll have quite a few more nodes than that before we're done. So the first thing we want to do is start putting our image together, because it's all in different parts at the moment. So let's take this render layer node, press Shift D to duplicate it, and then I'm going to change that to background. So now we have the two main parts of the render available separately. Now I have Node Wrangler installed. To do that, go to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, type in Node, and then Node Wrangler will come up and turn that on. Now that just adds in a few nice little shortcuts, one of which I'll be using a lot in this video, and that's to press Control, Shift, and then left click on a node, and it connects up a viewer node. In my case, it's gone way over here for some reason. I think that's because my node group was huge before I deleted it all. But yeah, so now when I press Control Shift left click, it will change the connection to that viewer node and let us see individual parts of our composition, which is really handy. I'm also going to disconnect the composite node for now because we don't need it. I'll plug that back in at the end. You may also find, depending on the resolution that you've rendered in, that this picture is either way too big or way too small. You can adjust that by pressing N, going to the View tab, and changing the zoom amount. Like so. Just get that to a decent size. Yeah, I think that'll work. Cool. Awesome, that's good. Okay, so let's start by combining these two together. Now to do that, we're going to press Shift A, go to Color, and then Alpha Over. And then I want to swap these around actually. Background first. Keep things neat and tidy for my brain. Feed the background into the top part of the alpha over node and the foreground into the bottom. Control Shift left click, and there we go. We've got our two render layers looking the way that they're supposed to. Now, we've still got a big blank area here. Now, what I did for this was bring in an image texture. And it was that Leak District one, which is a beautiful part of the world. And I'll Control-Shift, left-click on that. Now, as you can see, it's a different resolution to our image, which would cause a problem. In fact, I'll demonstrate. Let's add in another alpha overnode, not there. Ugh, it'll do. And feed our background in there. And now you can see our background's in there, but it's the wrong size and it's being cropped based on the resolution of the of this background image. So we need to stretch this to be the right size, and there's a node for that, thankfully. So press Shift A, go to Distort and Scale, and then we'll just drop that in there, and then you can set that to render size, and good. So our background is now the same size as our render, and then when we alpha over the background, it all looks right. So if I feed that into our existing setup here, left click on it, we'll see the complete image. We've got our background, well, our fake background, our rendered background, and our foreground. Okay, so now we have our scene together. I'm going to quickly bring up the final render that I did again, just so we can see how much work we have to do. And yeah, it's quite a lot. It's a bit of a jump from this rendered stage to the final composite. So let's start building that up. Now, the first thing we're going to do is adjust or add in the mist pass. Now, yeah, because of the way I put the scene together, and it's actually going to be two separate passes, essentially. I could have avoided this, but it's actually quite good to see the two different methods. I'll explain what I mean as we go. So, first of all, for the background, we're going to use the actual mist pass, which looks like that. Yeah. And it's actually very, very easy to add this into our composite here. I'm just going to add a color mix, drop that in there, turn it to screen, and feed the mist pass in. Now, what a screen node does is basically add the brighter areas in. Not quite actually. That's what an add node does. It's kind of like a multiply in reverse. Is probably the best way to describe it, but it's perfect for stuff like this. So if I set that to 0, we've got no mist whatsoever. If I set it to 1, we've got quite a bit. I actually went beyond 1 and used 2, I think, for my final scene. So I'll set that now, and then when we bring in the backdrop, you can see the mist in the background, and it looks pretty groovy. Now, I wanted to initially, anyway, use that same technique again. I have done a mist pass on the foreground here, but as you can see, because the foreground's a lot closer, and I've based the distance of the mist pass on the total size of the scene, which you can see somewhere. Yeah. So the mist pass is set from 5 to 5,000 meters, because the foreground's so much closer to the camera than the rest. You can't really, it's not having any useful effect. All of the detail is beyond the distance of the foreground, making this useless, which isn't awesome. So instead, we're going to use the old school method of using the depth pass, the Z pass. So what we're going to do instead is add in a map value range. So we can connect the depth pass to that, connect the viewer to that, and we see white. Not ideal. But as we start to bring down this size value, hopefully, yeah, you just start to see this kind of mist going on. Still too much, I think. Yeah, that's a good start. I'm going to set the maximum down as well. Now, I don't want, because I'm going to be, because this will have an effect on the rest of our whole image, including the background, I don't want to be working with really bright values, so I'm actually going to set that to 0.1. So we've only got a dark grey. It just makes it easier later on, as you'll see shortly. And then we've got an offset value. I don't want the mist to be right up to the camera, so let's set that to -20 or so. And then the mist will start on this kind of second hill here. So what we're going to do now is add in another color mix, feed our alpha over into there and our foreground mist there, And then we can start combining that into our finished result, which doesn't seem to be working. Let's set that to add, my bad. Cool. So we have, that's with no foreground mist whatsoever. We can still see the background mist nicely. And then as I start to bring this in, we get a little bit of that mist creeping into our render. But as you can see, it is having an effect on the background, so it's kind of a balancing act between this and the other pass. But I just found this the better route. You could, of course, I could have used the alpha of this to mask out the fog from the background, but then you see the transition around these leaves and whatnot, and it looks horrible. This method kind of blends it all nicely together. It's just a little bit more fiddly to work with. Anyway, let's call that done. We have our image together and our mist in. So next I'm going to take a look at the rolling fog, because that's quite fun to do and quite easy. So let's bring in an image, and it's that one. I'm going to steal this scale node because we're going to want to make sure that's the right scale again, and then let's take a look at it. Awesome. So we have this kind of like nice rolling fog type look, and what we want to do is combine that into our background. So the background for us starts here. This is where we want the rolling fog to be, and then we can either add it after the mist comes in or before. I'm going to add it afterwards, so it's this section here that we want to work on. So let's give ourselves some room. I'll probably start using some frames soon to make this a little bit more usable. Let's add in a color mix again. Feed in our screen value. And feed this in. And we'll set this to add, because we're going to add the white areas of this into our image directly. And then if I hit that, we've got our rolling fog. Yay! Some problems, obviously. The most notable one being that if we bring in our foreground, yeah, you can't see it anymore, apart from maybe a little smidge down there. So we're going to move basically the image up a little bit. To do that, let's go and get a transform node. I think that's the right one. Feed that in there, and connect that up to that, and then if I just click on that, we should be able to move that now. Yeah, so we can move that up until we get an acceptable sort of look. Let's try 350. 350 is a bit too much. I can see the bottom of the image cutting in there, so let's go with 300. Yeah, it looks nice. Got some nice rolling fog in the background, and then this add node gives us the ability to choose the strength. Yeah, so we can go something like, don't want to go too crazy, something like that. So we now have the mist and the rolling fog, and it's all looking very pretty, even if I do say so myself. Okay, so I've just created a frame. I kind of rushed through that actually, in case you haven't used them before. But yeah, Shift A, layout, frame, and then you can dump nodes in it, and then they stay together as a frame. And then when you go into N, you can go to Item and give it a label. I'm going to call this fog background, and give that a bigger size. And there we go. So we've got a little frame fog background, so we can start to keep track of what's happening as we continue to add in more complexity here. Now I'm actually going to duplicate all of this frame because I also want to add a similar effect. I'll bring it down here to the foreground. So let's call this one, funnily enough, foreground. I'm going to take that out. In fact, I don't even need that node at all, because I'm going to use the image as is and add in a subtle effect at this point. Connect. What am I doing wrong? It's not working. Uh-oh. Oh, it's because I don't need that node either. Idiot. Okay, so now I brought in some fog for the foreground as well. Now this I want really subtle because that looks stupid. but at a really subtle amount. It just gives that slight impression of there being a bit of air in the foreground as well. Cool. So that's that. We've done fog and we've done mist, and next up is Crptomatte. Dun dun dun. Okay, so if we look at the final image again, you'll notice that the grass has quite a bit of color variation to it, and this is something I should have done probably at the render phase, but I was using the grass world add-on, and it was the first time I'd used it, and I couldn't figure out a quick way of adding in sort of patchy color variation based off like a noise texture or whatever, and I couldn't be bothered to figure it out. So I decided to try and figure out a way to do it in post-processing, and it turns out it's very, very easy. And I'm going to share that now. So let's jump over to just specifically work on this foreground, because that's all we're working on, or that's all we're going to be affecting at the moment. And what I'm going to do is bring in I can't remember where it keeps it, a Cryptomatte node. Now, these Cryptomatte passes will only be available if you enabled those passes in the render settings down here. So make sure you do prior to rendering, otherwise you'll have to render again. But assuming you have, you just connect up the image and then the appropriate passes. Now I enabled object and material, and it's organized really messily here for some reason. But for this particular one, I want the grass material, so it's the material passes I want. And you've got 00, 02, 04. And then on the inputs, you've got 0001 and 02, which doesn't match up to that at all. It's crazy. I don't know. It needs to be a bit more clear, but basically just do them in order. So like that. No, sorry, material one. Ignore me. Material, and then material in order, and it will work. So when I click on this once, I get nothing. When I click on it again for the matte channel, I get nothing. But under the pick channel, I'll get this crazy breakdown of like the different materials that are in my scene. And then if I click on the add button, it allows me to add in one of these materials. So I'm going to grab this grass like so. And then if I go to the image, I'm just getting the grass. It's magically managed to pull that grass out and give me access to it on its own. Let me just make sure that's the only material that needs to be used here, because it looks like there might be two. And I want to make sure I get both. So let me just check that. Yeah, that's getting all the grass now. Good. So I've now got all the grass picked by the Crptomatte, and it gives us a mask to work with, most importantly. So if I now grab a I don't know, a hue and saturation node, for example, because I'm going to use one of those as well for this, and then feed in the image and the mask into the factor, this hue and saturation node will only affect what is in this mask. Yeah. So if I start changing the hue, say to, I don't know, 0.7, our grass changes color, but only that grass. Everything else remains the same, which is, quite frankly, witchcraft. I love it. But yeah, handy little tip. Now I'll leave that in place because I actually am going to want to desaturate this a little bit, but that's a later phase. First of all, though, let's bring in a new texture. Like so, so we can create this color variation. Now to do this, we're actually going to have to, I've probably already got one here, grass mask foreground. No, that's not it. Noise? Yeah, it's probably that one. But yeah, when you first bring this in, it won't have that. So what you'll need to do is jump over to the texture tab here and actually create a noise texture. Yeah. Which, is this the right one? Because I think I'm just getting a dodgy preview there. Who knows? But yeah, if the look of that is anything, oh, it has updated. If the look of that is anything to go by, we're good to go. And this is just a typical texture. You would have used textures before in here, I would assume. I don't make any particular strange settings, I don't think. Nope. Up to the contrast a little bit just to make the blacks a bit higher. I'm using a contrast of 1.3, and I lowered the scale a little bit, added some depth. But yeah, you can fit around with that. So if we take a look at this now, we have a noise texture. Now this one you don't have to adjust to the size of your scene, it does it automatically, but we have this nice cloudy noise texture. So what I'm going to do with that is grab another hue and saturation node, because remember this second one's going to be used for a separate control later, so just ignore that for now. I'm going to feed the image output of that into there, and then the image from there into there, just so it's going through the chain, as it were. And then I'm going to feed the value amount of the noise texture into the factor. No, sorry, into the hue, my bad. And then the mask from the Crptomatte into the factor. Connect those up, and then we can see what it's doing. So we've got the image coming in. That's just the image of the foreground. The noise is powering the hue, so that's why we're getting all this crazy kind of color. And the factor is being limited by the mask from the Crptomatte. I hope that all makes sense. I probably could have explained it better, but yeah, hopefully that. Hopefully you'll be able to work with that. Now we've got some nice color variation. Only trouble is we don't tend to see red grass that often, or blue for that matter. So we're going to use the typical math nodes that I've used countless times before in materials to limit the effect that the texture has. So let's add in a converter math node, 2 of them, one set to multiply, and the other set to add. And then I'll feed the value from there to there, and then that from there to there, and then that into the hue instead. And then these controls will allow us to perfect our overall look. So if I set the multiply to 0, that will mean that the noise texture is having no effect whatsoever. And this essentially becomes the hue value, which by default is at 0.5 anyway. So when I connect this up like that, it has no effect whatsoever. That's our starting point. Then as we start to increase this multiply value, we'll get more variation based off the noise texture, and then the add node allows us to shift it up and down the spectrum. So let's start with something like 0.35, because I think that's what I actually used. And now we can start to see the variation coming in, and it's looking nice and pretty. And then we can just lower this value to, I actually think 0.35 again will work. Let's have a look. Yeah, I don't think that looks too bad actually. So you do for now. Oh no, still got a bit of blue going on there. Don't want blue. Blue's not good. 375. There we go. So we have our grass variation, and then if we feed that into the rest of the effect and click on the last node, we'll have that color variation in our render. Great. Okay, so while we're at this stage, it's a good time to point out why I left this other hue and saturation node in. That's because we're going to start looking at colors now, and in this particular case, the grass is looking really way more saturated than the rest of the scene. So we've already got the Crptomatte all set up and good to go. So I can just lower that saturation, and you'll notice now the grass is starting to combine nicely with the rest of it, maybe even a little lower. Yeah, I think that looks kind of good. Now I'm not going to do it in this. In my final render, I didn't like the fact that these goats were identical colors, so I used the same principle to adjust that. Basically I will do it. Yeah, I will do it. I just can't resist it. So I'll feed this in, but in this case I'm going to use the object pass because I want to grab a specific object rather than a specific material, because obviously those goats are using the same material. Blank that out, and then turn this to pick like so. Oh, that looks quite hideous. And then I can just hit add and grab a specific goat like so, and then if I go to the mask, I've now got that goat, and I can do exactly the same as I've done previously. So I'll just grab another hue and saturation node, drop it in somewhere along the chain, feed the matte into the factor, and then in theory, if I reconnect this up, I should be able to specifically, in fact, because that saturation was already turned down, you can see the goats are now different colors. Fantastic. So yeah, I think I'll leave that there actually, that looks fine. What I will do is try and make this make some form of sense in terms of layout. What you could do is actually name these nodes, but I'm not going to go through that now. What I will do though is just dump the whole lot in a frame. So hopefully when you come back to it at some point, it makes some sort of sense as to what it's doing. Cryptomatte adjustments. No, put an R in for no reason. There we go. Cool. So we have our Cryptomatte adjustments, our fog foreground, fog background, and then the rest is just combining layers and stuff. I could probably separate, yeah. Just trying to keep this as neat as possible because it is a really good habit to get back through. Because I've done this before and used no frames whatsoever, and then you come back to it and you've got about 1,000 nodes sitting there and they make no sense whatsoever. So this is the foreground, in fact, mist foreground. Let's call it that. Oh my god, learned a spell, man. Thanks. And then where's our mist background? Our mist foreground. No, that's the fog background. Oh, I'm getting myself confused here. That's the mist foreground, isn't it? Yeah, mist, not fog. It's all going wrong. It's here. It's the mist pass. I'll just put that in a quick frame. I think my brain was getting confused between mist and fog there. Not good. So this is the mist background. Cool. So you can start to, yeah, pretty much see where we're going with this. Okay, so now we're getting closer. We've got an image that's all composited together. The colors kind of match. I'm not happy with the final colors, but they at least match and look like they're part of the same scene and everything, and the fog's in place. And yeah, random beeping of a horn outside. Thank you for that. Good. So now we're essentially getting onto the final sort of compositing steps that you would have done probably before. I'd hope so. If you're attempting this sort of tutorial, it probably wouldn't be the best first introduction to compositing anyway. So let's start by, first of all, going to the render panel, going to color management. Hopefully you're already using Filmic. If not, make sure Filmic's selected. And then we have look, which is set to none by default. Now, I'm going to go with very high contrast instead. In this particular example, it really kind of made the image pop. I was tempted to go with just high contrast, but I eventually decided on very high. It doesn't look great with the it's still very saturated, but once I took out the saturation, I just felt it really kind of popped. So before getting to final color adjustments, one thing I do want to do is add in some glare. Now, initially I went down the typical route of using either a glare node. I also tried, combining blurs together. The typical compositing steps that you would have seen in 1,000,001 Blender Guru tutorials of old. But I actually went down a different route with this one, mainly because you've got this big bright area here, and I kind of wanted that kind of God ray kind of look, and I was almost tempted to go back to the render phase and put in like a volumetric cube and try and create some cool God rays. And then I remembered that I didn't want to spend 8 months rendering, so I wanted to see if I could cheat it a little bit, and I kind of can. So let's take a look. We've got a node called Sunbeams, which is a weird little node, but I do like it. So let's feed in. Why are you? Oh, it's because I've got that. Can you stop that, please? Okay, with some weird clicking around, I finally managed to get rid of that. I'm not quite sure what was going on there. So yeah, we'll just pretend that didn't happen. Anyway, so yeah, I'm going to feed in our output from our compilation so far into the sunbeams. And let's take a look what sunbeams gives us. Not much. But yeah, set this to 0.5 to begin with, which is what the default was. It was just my clicking around that confused it. And then I'm going to add in some... I'll just set that to 1 so we can see what it's doing. And it kind of does that, which looks really kind of strange. But if I set this to say 0.1 and 0.1, nope, 0.1 and 0.9, sorry, it'll be up in that top corner, yeah, which is where the brighter area of our scene is. Let's move that along a little bit more. Maybe, well, that's quite nice actually. That's better than the one I used in my final. Yeah. So it's taking that brighter area and it's kind of giving us that kind of ray sort of look. A bit too defined though, so I'm then going to add in a blur node. I'll set that to fast Gaussian. Relative, and I don't know, about 5%. That's probably way too high actually. Actually, no, I like that. Yeah. So now I'm going to duplicate that add node. Like so. Feed the composite into that, feed this, whatever you want to call this, glare sunbeam thing into there, and then we'll be able to add that effect in. Take a minute to composite that together, I think. Cool. So yeah, if I set that to 12, no, if I set that to 1, that will give us the full effect, which will be ridiculously strong, but you can kind of see the effect it has. Yeah, it's not quite God rays, and it's definitely cheating, but yeah, it's passable. You know, it doesn't look too bad, especially considering it's 2 nodes and no effort. So yeah, if I don't know, lower this to about 0.2, maybe 0.3. Let's just see it with and without. Maybe I'm going a bit overboard actually. Yeah, we don't want it to be too crazy. Yeah, maybe a little lower, 0.2. Yeah, I think that'll be okay. Okay, it's giving that kind of impression that we're after, which is good enough for me. So after that, I'm going to just grab a hue and saturation node and decide on kind of like the final saturation value, which I want to be a lot less than this, to be honest. I'm going for kind of like British sort of wintry sort of look, and it's a very grey, dull country here. So I suppose if I was being realistic, 0.2 would be about where I'd want to be. Oh yeah, that's home. But yeah, for the sake of something that's a bit more visually appealing, we'll probably settle on something about there. We still want some of the colour coming through, but I just don't want it to look too saturated. And another horn beeping outside. Fantastic. Okay, so with that done, I'm going to add in a color balance node. And I'm just going to play with this until I get something that I like the look of. I think if we kind of go kind of blue on the midtones, but balance that out a bit on the high tones, adds to that kind of cold British wintry sort of feel. Can go a bit further, I think. At this sort of stage, I strongly suggest muting and unmuting, which you can do by pressing M, so I don't think I said that, and comparing with and without. It makes it a lot easier to get that perfect sort of amount that you're after. Cool, done. And then I'm going to add in a lens distortion just to give it a bit of that, so it looks like it's been taken from a camera. Even that's probably too much. Don't want to go crazy with that. Cool. And then the only final stage is to add in a little bit of a vignette. So let's go to our matte category, bring in an ellipse mask, click on that, and get this to the right scale. So 1 on the width, and for this aspect ratio, it should be about 0.565-ish for the height. Add in a blur to blur that effect, funnily enough. Like so. 25, I reckon. Nice. And then a final color mix set to multiply. Feed those two in and gives us a subtle vignette. Nice. So yeah, we've. I don't think that's quite the same as my final composite. What you can also do, though you can do post-processing for brightness and whatnot, I tend to like to work with the color management panel for that. So let's say I was looking at this and being like, I like it, but it's a bit dark. Rather than adding in a brightness node, I'd probably look to change the exposure setting here. I just find that works better. But that's just me. And yeah, I think that's just about it. Cool. One last step you'll want to do is grab that composite node that we disconnected and then reconnect that to the same place as the viewer node. That's just so if you hit render again, you'll instantly see the composited result at the end of the render, which is handy. To save this, you can't just go back over to the rendering. It won't always work. See here, this is a rendering I did on my previous composite and it didn't quite tie in right. It's certainly not the same as what we've just did. So the easier way is to go to the viewer node itself in the texture editor, and that'll be identical to whatever compositing you've done. Yeah, and then you can just save that as your final image and post it on ArtStation and bask in the glory of your success.